Yes, so today I want to talk about how the policies of the Eastern Cape provincial government after 1994 have been shaped by the legacies of the homelands. So historians have written a lot about how agricultural policy in Bantustan areas was incredibly forceful. Betterment policies trying to social engineer rural communities were implemented very forcibly in the 1950s and 60s. I, however, want to take up my narrative from the mid-1970s when it had become clear that these more forcible betterment policies had not improved agricultural production. And what we see from the late 70s onwards is agricultural policies which increasingly provide subsidized services and inputs which were supposed to stimulate agricultural production. So looking at animal welfare, for instance, you see government officers vaccinating 1.5 million cattle in Transkei in 1979 when just 7,000 had been inoculated a decade previously. And perhaps most importantly of all, the Transkei Department of Agriculture takes over livestock dipping from impoverished, dysfunctional traditional authorities run by local chiefs. Now, all these schemes, with a fair amount of money spent on them, failed to stimulate agricultural production, failed to turn Transkei into the dairy herd of South Africa, as was the dream of government planners. You can see their records in the archives. I think the ANC government faced perhaps three problems when they come into power at a provincial level. Firstly, the provincial government's inheriting agricultural projects that quite frankly had collapsed in the face of popular unrest. The invasions of the state farms at Mkombati were actually some of the more organized. In other localities, cattle dipping officers were being forced to flee when local communities were refusing to obey regulations. There was asset stripping, there was looting. I've even heard stories that there was a wave of poisonings after cattle dipping chemicals got stolen in a few areas. Secondly, the bloated machinery of government faces an organizational crisis in itself. As you can see on the map, the Eastern Cape was made out of the dysfunctional bureaucracies of the old Transkei and Ciskei, and they tended to get some of the dregs of the old Cape administration, government officials who hadn't been able to get jobs elsewhere. Now, none of these people could be sacked under the clause in the Constitution, that the sunset clause. And just to give you, put some numbers to this, in the final 5 years of the Bantustans, Transkei's bureaucracy, the numbers in it had increased by 50%. So, as you can imagine, the Eastern Cape government just trying to sort out their organogram. I mean, quite frankly, I think it takes about a decade, and whether they've done it today, still an open question. A third problem for agriculture was that the national government had decided that rather than ineffectively subsidizing infrastructure such as cattle dipping programs, such as subsidized tractors, such as providing fencing, much better to direct limited resources towards social welfare. So in effect, the National Treasury manages to squeeze and reduce the provincial Eastern Cape Department Agricultural budget diminishes under Treasury pressure, whilst at the same time the provincial education department's budget is rising. So basically, the provincial Department of Agriculture has got to make cutbacks and retrenchments. In my project, I tracked this particularly in the livestock dipping program. You can see what goes on the ground. About 1,000 odd livestock dipping officers, they get sent to the schools to become janitors. The local communities are told to form their own committees and take over the cattle dipping infrastructure. And on the ground, by and large, things didn't work out very well. I've seen indicative figures that perhaps only half the rural communities ever managed to form effective committees, in part a problem of poverty, often in part a problem of local factional politics. So as cattle dipping diminishes, there's almost a plague of tick-borne livestock diseases returning to the region when just 10 years previously there hadn't been any.